Good morning, good afternoon to you all. Thank you, Josh. This conversation, which we are having, is as part of the global program of the VCA, a series of conversations around climate finance or the climate finance work program. The overall outcome, which we are trying to achieve through a number of activities in the global program, is around creating a supportive conditions and regulations of international funds for climate for local climate action finance. And under this, we have a number of activities we were looking at. One is to promote engagement at the UNFCCC processes, which includes the loss and damage finance. There is a conversation around the new collective quantified goal, and we have been making submissions, and that's one of the priority areas. And then in terms of influencing the international financial institutions, we are planning to engage the Green Climate Fund, and the next one will be the MDB reform agenda. I think you may be aware that this conversation has started over the last 2-3 years, and it is sort of gaining momentum. And obviously, in the coming weeks, we would like to engage with you on this agenda as well. And then the last item in terms of the program, we are working around to promote and mobilize finance for local climate solutions. One of the activities which we have been undertaking in the last 2 years is to identify alternative climate finance delivery mechanisms. And I think there has been some publications produced through VCA. And then obviously we'll continue in terms of developing a portfolio of locally led climate solutions, as well as we would start tracking the next level grant facility. But more importantly, for the conversation which we are trying to have today on loss and damage finance, I think just to probably my colleagues will speak to it, but it's just introductory. To start with the definition, I think there are various definitions, but the exact definition provided by the UNFCCC is loss and damage is to include harms resulting from sudden onset events, which includes climate disaster, cyclones, and slow onset processes such as sea level rise. And it could include damages or risk of future damages beyond those addressed by climate adaptation actions. Thus, loss and damage are sometimes called residual impacts or risks. And then again, the loss and damage are impacts of climate change which are not avoided by mitigation, adaptation, and other measures such as disaster risk management. This could include permanent and irreversible loss, such as to lives, livelihoods, homes, and territory for which an economic value can be calculated. And there are obviously non-economic impacts, such as loss of culture, identity, biodiversity, which cannot be quantified in monetary terms. So in this regard, I think the last COP agreed to establish a new funding arrangements, respond to loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change. The fund, I think the conversation has started, it has established a transitional committee on operationalization of new funding arrangements that has been established. So I think at this point in time, there has been 2 sessions, and we are headed to the 3rd session of the transitional committee on operationalization of new funding arrangement. Under this program, the VCA is planning a few activities. One is to socialize the loss and damage finance within the Alliance and civil society sector. At some point after this conversation, of today's conversation, we are hoping to develop a VCA position on loss and damage finance and identify opportunities for engagement at the regional and global level, and engage the transitional committee on loss and damage finance. And I think there is a number of opportunities for submission. I think one submission is open at this point in time, and hopefully working with your colleagues, we could do some of the submissions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Yared. And I think with with that scene setting, I think we've kind of we've been able to get a sense of we've laid the groundwork for the discussion that is coming. And at this point, we will be hearing from our panelists who will be, introducing us to this discussion and giving their perspective on the different aspects of loss and damage. But I think the key things that we want to come out with from this discussion is a clear understanding of loss and damage, both in terms of what the issues are that need to be dealt with and addressed, and what possible responses can there be to issues around loss and damage. And secondly, we also want to frame the loss and damage discourse from a civil society and a rights holders perspective. This is very important, especially for us within the VC and the work that we do with different communities. So hopefully through this discussion with our various discussants, we will get a better sense of this. And again, urging all of us to participate, think about it, consider issues from your perspective that you might be able to bring to the table through the Q&A. You can use the Q&A box, but you can also post comments. Preferably, we'd like to take live questions at the end, but if there is something really, really burning that speaks directly to something that one of our panelists is speaking on, then you could raise your hand and we might consider having that, and of course with the permission of the panelist. But yes, just one small technical issue that I am reminded of, and I'd just like to remind our panelists, just for the purposes of interpretation, if we could speak at a nice measured pace so that our able interpreters can keep up and make sure that we are coming across as clearly as possible. So I suppose to open it up, Adrian, I'm going to put you on the spot now. Mr. Adrian Martinez is from La Ruta del Clima, and I am kind of looking to you to start laying the groundwork in this discussion and maybe tell us from your perspective, what is loss and damage and how do we define it, in addition to the scene setting that Yared already did. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think as our colleague mentioned, the SBI has produce some literature review on possible definitions and elements that loss and damage can have. That is pretty much what we have from the UNFCCC. We're still lacking a formal definition, at least something that legally bounds parties in terms of what is exactly loss and damage. And that is probably one of the main weaknesses of the whole process that we have. Even though we are on a progressive and exciting new path of creating a loss and damage fund, we're still missing a very key elements, such as, for example, information systems or methodologies to actually determine what is loss and damage on the ground. And that is super essential for communities that may eventually want to have a direct claim on loss and damage resources to address it, or governments that want to do that in behalf of rights holders in communities that are marginalized or specifically affected. So that is one of the key issues in terms of definitions and lack of a structure, which then presents the challenge for the transitional committee to respond to these beneficiaries that unfortunately have not yet been consulted in the current process, and that are supposed to generate very quickly a fund that in nature addresses directly these necessities in a scope that is additional, but also that is different in terms of how the funds or the resources are accessed, but also in the nature that they can be accessed, as we're dealing with probably the most vulnerable and underrepresented communities and across the global south and in some regions of the global north. So this is one of the significant challenges. And beyond that, I think it comes to discussion that is very at heart of any global south NGOs in terms of remedies or redress. I think the nature of why the loss and damage fund has to have resources should not deviate from this 3 decades demand that many countries and many NGOs have had of an obligation of transboundary environmental harm that is basically what has caused loss and damage. And if we see, and if we go back to the objectives of the convention, they're supposed to be 3 decades ago a reduce in greenhouse emissions that would have been in a manner that allow ecosystems to adapt. That is something that has not been achieved. It has not been reduced. It has not been stabilized. And what we're seeing is the aftermath. And we're also conscious that the transition or the efforts that should have taken place in terms of mitigation and adaptation, according to Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, the obligation to provide finance is one of developed countries. So in this discussion, when we, of course, try to find additional funds or try to find financial arrangements to provide resources to then address the needs of communities, we have to always maintain this rights perspective that is the community's right to have reparations, that there is legal responsibility that countries have, not only in terms of human rights, but in transboundary environmental harm. And that's something that in the discussion can get lost. And at least I'm a bit afraid that our anticipation for having a result after 30 years of waiting for something keep us away from our goal, that is justice. And I guess that would be my main message. And there's many other things that we can take on account, for example, non-economic loss and damage, and how it should be addressed, and the process of consultation in terms of what communities demand as a right that should be what they receive in terms of, for example, cultural loss or identity loss or transgenerational psychological trauma due to loss and damage. But I think I'll leave some space for my colleagues to sort of fill this parts of the conversation. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Adrian. Just from what I'm hearing, before I move on to the next thing, for me, there are two things that stand out. It's the period of time we are talking about. We have been talking about 30 years so far, but we are also talking about a lack of clear definition. On the one hand, you've got clear demand. On the other hand, you've got a problem with defining this. And for me, I just want to probably hear more from your perspective about what role politics plays, because when you talk about lack of clear definitions, it is unclear for me whether it is definitions around what constitutes climate-related damage and loss that needs to be dealt with, or is it a question of responsibility on the part of countries that are the leading emitters, for example?
No, I think one leads to the other. Loss and damage was an issue since the negotiation of the UNFCCC convention itself. Is something that has been attempted to get into the legal structure of the convention for many years. And the fact that it has not, even though it's something that is very logical, we're talking about environmental transformation of our planet that is generating harm. And we knew it since the start. But the fact is that there has been countries, including the US, and I think the last statement from John Kerry, the U.S. envoy, about not providing reparations ever for loss and damage, it's just strange that it is a structural and political determination of certain states of avoiding, by all means, dealing with loss and damage. We saw it, for example, in the creation of the Paris Agreement, where the attempt to put within the text of the Paris Agreement a clause where liability and compensation would be written off, and then again it was included in the decision that accompanies the Paris Agreement in paragraph 51. So there has been an attempt to delay, to distort, and to obstruct a correct addressing of this issue. And if you go to any of our communities in the Global South and you talk to a fisher person, if you talk to a person that works on the land, you'll note that they have been suffering changes for more than a decade, and loss and damage is there each time there is a flood. Loss and damage is there when women have to deal with their communities and their economy, when the men leave to cross a border to find jobs, and they have to take this burden out of their own pocket. So it's not something that countries were not aware. It's something that it's just been underfunded. We see that mitigation, which is the cause of loss and damage, is underfunded. And so there is a structural void. And this is pretty much what we have been fighting. And this is also the fact with the issue of definition. If you cannot have a formally agreed definition on the parameters and how you measure and what it is and what it is not, and how you address it, and of course, who's responsible and the allocation of that responsibility, especially in financial or legal terms, then you cannot solve it. And that is a political issue. That is a political issue that has been constructed. And it goes very along with the idea that human rights within the convention is something that is taboo, that is not taken seriously enough. And for example, just having paragraph 51 excluding compensation and liability, despite being something part of international law, despite being mentioned in principle 12 of the Rio Declaration that was created along with the convention, despite being something that is a right of communities in one of the biggest crises that we're facing, it is just to highlight how structural and evident this is, and what a challenge in terms of the structural violence it is for the communities and eventually for complete regions of the global south.
Thank you. And the last thing that I'd like you to touch on, Adrian, because it kind of flows from this, and then I'd like to hear a perspective from Protas on this as well, is there is, I mean, we talk about the transitional committee and a lot of the work and that goes into crafting language around loss and damage. And obviously, clearly there's still lack of clear definition, but from the perspective of voice, and for us as VCA, this becomes very important. What has civil society, what have these communities been doing in terms of articulating clearly issues of loss and damage over this long period of time? And in your perspective, looking at I suppose the levels of success or lack thereof in getting that voice across, what needs to be done? What more could be done? Is there anything from the perspective of communities and civil societies that could actually change this, start to shift things in this, what is in all manner of thinking, political impasse? I mean, the deeper issues, you talk about human rights issues being taboo in that space, and the difficulty in trying to have any discussions when it comes to issues of human rights. So
Sure.
is there anything that communities for their part can do differently or should be doing, and would make a difference?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, 6 months ago, before the COP27 decision, we were still just struggling to have loss and damage on the agenda. And 6 months afterwards, communities are required to find a way to have a say in this report that the transitional committee will then provide to the SBI. And probably in December, the real political fight is when it's going to start, when countries themselves, not just these appointed committee members, but countries themselves, their delegates, are going to grab these reports and the different options that they provide and start doing the politicking about this, the negotiating, the really deciding the structure of this. For communities, it's a challenge because 6 months ago, there was no idea that there was going to be a fund, and there is no mechanism, or there was not a mechanism in place beyond the submissions that specialized civil society can make in terms to the transitional committee on what the communities may or may not want. But then the time to consult, the time to explain, to raise awareness, to then understand, and for the communities to absorb and then provide political input on what they require to deal issues, for example, with culture or existential issues like human mobility. It is very fast. So we're in this dilemma where we wanted something really fast, but then again, the main stakeholders, the rights holders, the people in the community that know what they need, that are dealing with issues that we are still not comprehending, because loss and damage is something that is not completely understood or studied. There's some case studies, but it's not a deep understanding as we don't have the means to even measure it and compare it from one community to the other. So this is the basic thing. I think that for the meeting in August and also for the meeting in COP28 in December, communities are sort of in the need to provide this perspective in some way or manner, be it that it's in a statement, be it that it's in videos, be it that is trying to reach out to the regional TC member that is in your continent and tell them, for example, our colleague in Colombia, oh, this is what we think from communities in the Amazon, or communities in Central America, communities in South Africa. Reach out to those committee members and point out what you need. And so try to get into that report your perspective and comment in what way, what communities as beneficiaries required to access those funds and what should be funded, because this is the structure that we're creating now. And if the structure does not match reality, then we won't have the effectiveness and the justice that we want. And also to reclaim the narrative that it is remedies, that it's a right to be funded, that is not something that charities should provide, that is not voluntary. If John Kerry, for example, decides that they want to pledge $1 million, especially when we're talking about trillions of dollars over decades, because loss and damage is not something like mitigation. It's not something that happened one-off and then you just fix it. It's something that transform our reality and that will continue having an effect in the lives of people, probably through generations. And that is the legacy that we have to protect for future generations by creating structures that ensure their livelihoods.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Actually, I'm going to come to you, Taki, Dr. Mo Taki from Concepci, and maybe talk about the community's perspective and the experience before we shift over to you, Protas, to talk a little bit about civil society. So, I'd like to welcome you.
In short time, I will share my perspective and about the loss and damage, and it is the frame from Indonesian civil society. And regarding to the question, what is the loss and damage and how, right? Based on the literature review and experience, loss and damage refer to the negative or destructive experience impact of climate change in social, economic, and financial, environmental, and cultural, which cannot be restored or repaired both remedies and present. And how we define it? We can contextualize definition and frameworks of LND on the local understandings, experiences, and realities on the negative impact of climate change. So the keyword is how to contextualize of LND. Regarding the civil society analysis of LND responses, there are three issues. The first, civil society must develop a framework based on local context regarding LND, including comprehensive understanding of using participatory tools in livelihood assets like human, physical, economic, social, and natural. Second is maybe we can try to calculating existing economic value LND and potential of projected economic LND in all of livelihood assets as a climate risk value. And the third is maybe we can try to focus to the bearers, subnational, national, and global as material in climate LND financing. What are the loss and damage issues from climate affected communities? based on our grounded research in several targeted sites of VCA Indonesia, the issues related to LND from cognitive perspective is the first is LND is acknowledged as the effect of climate shocks due to long drought or storm, like the level of disaster. LND is the destruction of the surrounding environment, like rivers and forests, which impacted the disappearance of their food sources. And the last is LND is regarded as social and economic disadvantages due to annual tidal floods as impacted of land subsidence. So, what the alternative approach or response to loss and damage? Maybe it is my opinion. So, we can try to develop local climate LND financing mechanism by use the philanthropy approach, and then we can dialogue, communicate with the national and the global, in the global level, and maybe the global level we can be developed like the public fund mechanism from like the developed country to developing country, and we can adopt like mechanism payment for environmental services.
Thank you very much, Taki. Much appreciated and very, very clear. So you've given us a clear, view of what, how this affects communities and how, the experience on the part of communities, whether it's through, the impact on their livelihoods, on their food sources, as well as on their land. I mean, we talk about tidal floods and, land subsidence and all of that. And these are very real impacts that communities are facing, which are clearly related to a changing climate. The question for me is then, so if all of this is changing and impacting communities' livelihoods to this degree, I mean, you have spoken about, a number of possible interventions. Enter the role of civil society, and coming to you, Protas. What is civil society's perspective? How does civil society function in terms of articulating these issues, finding a coherent voice and making sure that that voice is impactful on the policy space at a multilateral level? Over to you, Protas.
If we refer to the how to strategic role of the civil society, I think the main role of the civil society is how to facilitate local community to find and to understand what their vulnerability and identify their capacity to overcome the negative climate impact of climate change. And then after that, maybe we can gather with the community to discuss, to make the community action plan if on the our based on our mapping on our discussion previously, and then we can voice out the community action plan to the government, both in the subnational, national, even to the global level. So the other role of the civil society is the advocate beside the facilitator.
Thank you so much for that, Taki. And I think that might be echoed quite clearly in, I don't want to anticipate what your comments will be, Protas, but yeah, please go ahead, Protas.
Okay, thank you, George, and everyone who's attending. I think the discussion here is about the definition of loss and damage, and I agree with the former speakers. We've tried so much to come up with a definition of what this is all about and what's the role of the civil society. But my contribution is this, that we have two things that are lacking. Of course, civil society acts as the intermediary between community and the policy makers and maybe the international players or the funders. But now we have to question, the question is, do they really take serious consideration of the communities they are serving? When we are coming up with these definitions, for example, about loss and damage, whose input informs the final decision? I come from a region in Kenya which has a rainforest, but Kenya also has the northern region, northeastern region that has not seen rain for the last 4 years. So my definition of loss and damage from where I come from could be so different. It could be about floods, it could be about landslides. But do any civil society organization working in northern eastern Kenya sit down with these people and ask them that for how you've survived without rain for 4 years, how have you managed to go about this? So when we are talking about loss and damage, if, for example, people in this region are nomads, and most men have now left their homes, they are going to other regions to take care of their livestock, and they have left behind women and children who are going to school, some who don't have food. But these are effects of climate change, which possibly they did not cause. So how then do we bring in their contribution to make sure that once the world agrees about what this loss and damage is, then we are able to cater for everyone? Another key consideration is language, and you mentioned about language. When we are talking about these definitions, in what language are they? Do the masses get to understand? Because I'm able to speak English, but my mother is 74 years old. She has a lot of knowledge about climate change. What has changed for the last 70 years? I was not there in the last 70 years, but she could be having solutions to what the world is going through today. How do we make sure that the civil society, as intermediaries between communities and policymakers and any other player in this field, are able to package the information or get to know that this is what's about to happen, or this is, we are talking about loss and damage. What is your input? How do we get to you in the language that you understand? Because basically right now, and I will speak for the case of Africa, it's about English and French. But research shows that possibly only 40% of Africans can understand these languages. So what about the 60%? And then the 60% we are talking about are, for example, people who live near lakes and who have a lot of knowledge about why the lakes are filling up, why their houses are being submerged in water. I know most of us here have are watching the world, the Women World Cup. And mostly before these matches begin, you see the indigenous people, I think in New Zealand or Canada, who come and entertain people before matches begin. But now the question is relating to us when we are going for these international discussions about climate change. How do we bring in these indigenous people? How do we bring in the vulnerable people, the women and the youth? Do we only take a few of them to COPs and display them and say, these are the communities, or we fully engage them from the beginning? Yeah, I stop there.
No, thank you very much, Protas. You raised some very pertinent issues, which also, to my mind, go back to the point that Adrian was raising earlier on about fundamental rights. I mean, without can you all hear me? Okay, just making sure. Okay, yeah. without the ability to understand what the global discourse is around loss and damage, without the ability to know what is being discussed and to be able to articulate yourself, then you're completely excluded from the discussion. You cannot talk about communities actually being involved when they're being actively excluded in the discussion. So I think that does very much resonate with the points that were made by both Taki and by Adrian. I'm going to pause there, just looking at the time, and maybe open the floor to any questions, some discussion from the audience. We will invite you to raise your hand at this point if you have a comment or something related to your particular context. I know we've got quite a few people on the in our discussion today. I see the first hand up is Wilson Kipkazi. I would invite you to unmute yourself and please go ahead and ask your question. And if you don't mind, while you're asking your question, if it is directed at one particular member of our panel, please make that clear. Wilson, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Wilson Kipkazi. I come from the Lurais indigenous community in Kenya. We are a pastoralist community who live around Lake Bogoria. And you are aware from the effects of climate change, the Rift Lake's water rose beyond almost 4 meters high. And communities lost their homes, their farmlands around the lake, who are actually outside the riparian area. They lost hospitals, schools, churches, and even our old shopping center was submerged in the lake. Now, the water has receded at the moment, and of course, the people will not go back because one, the lake is a salty lake, so the whole area is dead, including the plants and everything. Now, the question is, in terms of loss and damage, I know UNFCCC, raise some fundamental issues to address loss and damage. Now, can these indigenous communities get compensation? Because now the lake is no longer the area where they used to inhabit. They have lost it. And as you mentioned, the land, the assets of the people are all destroyed. So how can it be addressed in terms of loss and damage? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Wilson. Great points raised there, and very clear questions. I'm wondering if one of our panelists, maybe Adrian, do you want to address that or protest?
Thank you, Jules. Adrian can also react after myself, but I think we are all in agreement that there is no inclusivity in this discussion. And what my friend from Kenya is raising is true, is what I alluded to earlier, that for us to have an inclusive discussion about what loss and damage is to take into consideration every player. And this we are talking about the communities that is talking about. These are people who have lived around there for ages, but someone in Paris or someone in Morocco just says, let us define this as loss and damage. So when the waters are submerging your houses, then you have nothing to worry about. We will look at our document and say, if you don't merit this, then you can die. You don't die. I think the discussion should be, how do we bring on board everyone? Because climate change affects everyone. And when we are talking about everyone, it's not about those people who just went to school. It's about our grandfathers who have been living around lakes or mountains or all those places. They can define and say, in 10 years ago, this is what happened. But what's happening right now, we did not anticipate it. How much, if we were to be paid, how much does this cost? So I think it's a matter of representation, it's a matter of inclusivity.
Thank you, Proteus. Barbara, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much. And my question, okay, I have I had first a comment that I would like to request the first panelist really to give us a very brief outline of the process, just for the team on the call to understand where we are, the transitional committee, what is doing, what's mandate, what we should expect, by COP. That would help the VCA team and everyone on the panel to see and understand how we can engage. My comment goes to Protus, yeah. And it's really the dilemma we have. There's the ideal of achieving inclusion. We all want to achieve inclusion. The challenge is that we are engaged in a political process that is murky, that often we can't control. And as the first panelist indicated, since the convention, we have been lobbying for reparation, loss and damage. It has just been achieved in COP27 and has actually achieved at the end when civil society said we are not going to agree to anything until you sign on the loss and damage. It was signed on, quickly. Now we have the urgency of action, but on the other hand, we also have the urgency of really getting the momentum to move a goal we've achieved. The process of inclusion takes so long. Globally, having every indigenous person participate in having a say, etc. will take too long before we have a definition, before we have the funded. And that long process is to the advantage of those that want to delay this process. So yeah, our view, all of us, and maybe for you, Protus, there's the ideal vis-a-vis the challenge of achieving something within this context that we often don't control. What's your take on that?
Thank you so much, Barbara. Just before I possibly hand it to Adrian to give maybe a brief response on that, just to point out that some of the really good questions you ask in terms of the process and everything will be covered in our next presentation. So let's bear that in mind. I did see that Edda's hand was up, but I would also like to, just looking at the comment box before I hand over to our panelists. Olivia Tatarleti, some of the comments that you're making are very insightful, and I was wondering if you might consider muting yourself briefly and maybe throwing in a couple of comments once we've heard from our panelists and from Edda as well. Edda's hand went back down. I don't know if it's the question has been covered or not, but yeah, maybe let's Edda, if you hold on a second, let me just check with my panelists if they would prefer. Shall we maybe hear from Edda and then come back to you if there's something you want to jump in on? All right, so maybe go ahead, Edda, first.
Okay, good evening. My name is Edda. I'm from Kenya, and maybe mine is not in form of a question, but just a comment regarding the responsibilities that civil societies play. I believe that the civil society organizations played a very big role in contributing to the agreement of establishing the loss and damage finance. And I also believe that they are the ones who will play the role to maybe create the definition of loss and damage. And the definition need not to come from them, the civil society, but from the communities who are affected, because they are the ones who knows well how to define how they are affected by the climate change. So I would advise that the civil society organizations goes to the ground where the people are suffering, like where the loss has occurred, to listen to the people and maybe document every loss that has been experienced. And then after documenting now, they will now be able to create a narrative that mirrors everyone's voice within the local communities, those who have been affected. So that when we have another meeting, maybe in the COP28, there would be advancement. So now the funds has been established. So what? Because I know the people we expect to compensate the loss and damage, they will need evidence, they will need data, and will we have that data as the communities, or will we also say, okay, until you have data is when we are going to release the funds? So it's our responsibility to have everything at hand as civil society and prepare for the funds. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that valuable comment. Olivia, I'm actually looking at the comment you put here. Sorry, before I will come to to our panelists as we wind down the session to maybe give some responses on comments, just to wrap the session up. But your comment about the work that your NGO does, Legal Response International, with the explainer on the efforts, sheds light on efforts made by the parties to address the issue of loss and damage. And I'm wondering, is this targeted to NGOs, to civil society, for example, and it exists in French and English, but we are hearing a lot about communities and the need for communities to be part of this conversation. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about how that is targeted and how much further is there potential for it to go in terms of reaching communities with drawing them into this discourse. Sorry to put you on the spot, but if you're able to speak to that, it would be great.
Absolutely, Josh. Thank you very much. And hi everyone. I'm Olivia from the UK, based in the UK rather. So briefly, Legal Response International is an NGO that was set up 15 years ago to provide legal advice at the UN climate change negotiations, recognizing that there is a big imbalance of power between developed nations that have less resources in terms of lawyers and expertise. And so this year, with the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27, we saw there was really an opportunity to provide a bit more of a background explanation of what loss and damage is at the international level, what is understood by it, and the efforts, the obviously very small efforts that have been made by parties so far to try and address it, to paint the picture of what's already there and explain the basic terminology. So we are all, legal background people that try to demystify and explain in plain and simple English some of these complex topics. And hence we've also provided it in French. It should be provided in much more languages, but we're a very small team, unfortunately. One thing to be said in the context of, the voices of communities, agreed with the previous speaker, it's really that which is valuable and needed in this process. Unfortunately, the process is not set up in a way to facilitate that. It is the people at the table who have a say are the countries, they are the heads of states. So civil society has has a lobbying voice, but at the end of the day, they cannot make the decision. The decision is made by the governments. And in some countries with no governments are on the side or not on the side of civil society on some issues. So that's something to consider. But more generally on this loss and damage explainer, it is really aimed at an entry level. So it is hopefully approachable by the communities and understandable. It's not just for negotiators or for civil society who have been in this process. In fact, for them, it will be quite basic, I would say. So I encourage to have a look, and if there's anything that's unclear, to get in touch with us on our website. We have our contact details and we can try and provide further explanation if needed.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Much appreciated. Thank you for your intervention. Just before we wrap up this session, I'm going to give a final comment slot to you, Protas, and then I'll come to Adrian. Just hearing what, the couple of comments you've heard, if there's anything that jumps out, some parting words that you might share with us on this first bit. Protas, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Josh. And I think the discussion is nice, and it's a beginning, because all of us are agreeing that the civil society plays a key role in linking the communities to governments, as they are being called right now. But the challenge to the civil society now should be, we should not stop what we are doing. We should not stop what we have achieved. If the money comes, let us use what is existing so that we start paying it out. But I know it's not something that will be done today or tomorrow. Let us do what is happening right now, but also take into consideration what the voices that are being raised, so that if the money is here today and they say country A or Protas can get it, then what about that person in Baringo? So that in the coming days or in the coming months or coming years, his or her voice is heard, and then we say the process is inclusive. Otherwise, if we move like this, then we'll be leaving a huge population, which is so much helpful in this discussion, but they will not benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Protas. One of our panelists, Adrian, has already left the discussion. I think he had to rush off. But Taki, maybe with just a very, very quick 5-second final word from you before we close this session.
Want to summarize LND, we contextualize. If we want to make be inclusive.
Thank you very much, Taki. Short and sweet. Thank you to you, Taki, and thank you, Protas, and in absentia, thank you to Adrian for that first session. We are trying to keep our time just because we've got quite a lot to cover, but I think we are doing very well. And at this point, I would like to welcome our next speaker, Andres from Avina, from Fundación Avina. And I think your presentation in a lot of ways will be a great explainer to some of to a lot of us, and in some way maybe also respond to some of the questions that Barbara asked. So I'm going to hand over to you and pass the mic on. Welcome, Andres.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you again for the invitation to our VCA project. I think just to follow up on the conversations before I begin my presentation, one of the problems that we've had in the negotiations has been to attempt to provide an all-encompassing definition on anything. And even before we had the conversations around loss and damage finance, on finance itself, I think many of you will be aware there is no definition of climate finance, but attempting to define one has taken a long time, and it hasn't necessarily helped us in terms of identifying what it is that needs to be financed and what shouldn't. So my point there being that when thinking about loss and damage, it might not be necessary to find an all-encompassing definition, but rather to identify what are the types of losses and damages that need to be financed, like floods, for instance, or like glacier retreat, instead of trying to put everything together in a single basket. Because from my perspective, that is one of the things that has been limiting the conversations around loss and damage, and it responds a little bit more to the agenda of the global north and of developed countries to have what we in the negotiations call talk shops, to have workshops and technical papers and endless conversations around conceptual issues rather than landing on what needs to be done. But I'll begin the conversation around what is the background around the UNFCCC on the loss and damage discussion. Adrian mentioned it at the beginning. The loss and damage conversation has been around for a very long time. Loss and damage discussions are as old as the convention itself. Back in 1994, there were proposals to include loss and damage as part of the language of the convention, but it wasn't until 2007, until COP13, that the loss and damage term was actually included in negotiation text and in COP decisions. It was after 3 years in COP16 that a work program was created to increase the understanding of how to assess and address climate-related losses and damages. And the first big milestone to my perspective was the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage in 2013, COP19. But it's important to understand that the loss and damage conversation has not been a solely technical discussion. but it's also been a very politically charged conversation, because negotiations around adaptation in particular, and we all recognize that there's a clear linkage between adaptation and loss and damage, but negotiations around adaptation have always had the narrative of historical responsibility, those who bear the burden of climate impacts, and those who have participated less in the causes around those burdens and around those consequences of climate change. So the conversation around loss and damage is stronger in the sense that it has made reference to responsibility, liability, and compensation. And this has been, and I'm going ahead of myself because I have a slide on the context, but this has been one of the biggest political clashes between the global north and the global south around loss and damage, because we know that eventually a conversation around loss and damage has to be linked to finance, and it hasn't until very recently. But when we talk about finance, we'll discuss responsibilities and commitments around who provides that finance. Now, coming back to COP19, the Warsaw International Mechanism, the previous slide, please. The Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage had three main objectives, the three functions, two of which have to do with increasing understanding of what we're talking about when we refer to loss and damage. So the first one has to do with enhancing knowledge and understanding of approaches to assess loss and damage, strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among stakeholders. And the third was an expectation of developing countries to finally link a conversation around problems with solutions to those problems. Because the third function of the WIM was to enhance action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address loss and damage. But since 2013 until now, the WIM has not been able to do that because it's a committee. It's a gathering of people that happens every few months, so it's not in a capacity to enhance action and support, including finance. Sadly, there was never a link between the WIM and actual resources to enable it to comply with that mandate. Now, after 2013, there was another big milestone in the Paris Agreement, because the agreement itself has an article on loss and damage, which is Article 8. But Article 8 is limited to, again, enhancing technical exchanges and enhancing technical understanding of what we're referring to with regards to loss and damage. So my reading of a decade of enhancing technical understanding is that if we continue to push for the idea that we continue to need technical understanding and technical exchanges, that's all we'll get. So what happened next in the loss and damage agenda was in Madrid in COP25. Many of you may have heard of the Santiago Network on averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Now, the Santiago Network is an enabling arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism focused on technical support. It is similar to what in the technology world in climate change, the role of the CTCN, the Climate Network and Technology, the Climate Technology Network. But the Santiago Network is meant to work as a network of institutions that can catalyze technical assistance to those countries or communities that request of it, coming from relevant organizations, bodies, experts, and help in the implementation of relevant approaches for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage at the local, national, and regional level. Now, it's important to note that regardless of the Santiago Network being created in COP25, so this is 2019, the Santiago Network is not yet operational. It is not yet working. There's still a conversation as to the host institution of the Santiago Network. Then there should be an actual creation of the network itself, and including all the institutions that form part of the network, and eventually the network should become operational at a state in which it can receive requests for technical assistance from countries. But again, the Santiago network is just technical assistance. COP26 next year was a very tense one. The G77 in China, which, as you know, is the group of all developing countries, submitted a proposal to create a loss and damage finance facility, the Glasgow Loss and Damage Finance Facility. And this was a response to the Santiago network being an agreement that had to reduce the ambition of the original proposal. So the proposal in COP26 was blocked by developed countries because of the reasons have been said everyone about, and the agreement was to create another dialogue, so another talk shop, a dialogue between parties, relevant organizations, stakeholders to discuss agreements on the funding of loss and damage. It did focus on funding loss and damage, but it was just a dialogue on how loss and damage can be funded. And there was a very strong link historically between finance for loss and damage and private insurances, because the response for a very long time for developing countries was, if you need finance for loss and damage, you need to hire an insurance, and that's how you get finance. And finally, after having this dialogue, the first dialogue took place last month in Bonn, but it did have the upside of being able to focus on the loss and damage fund that was created in last COPs. So the space in which the fund was meant to be discussed was created before the fund itself, but it did at least work out. And COP27 had to respond to the G77 tabling an agenda proposal again, which stopped the beginning of the COP for a few days. And the agenda was on matters related to funding arrangements for addressing loss and damage. Now, COP27 was a very politically charged negotiation. The support of civil society organizations in the creation of a fund was crucial, as well as the support of the media. And developed countries got to a point where they were basically against the wall in not wanting to look as the bad guys opposing the creation of a fund. So COP27 agreed to a couple of things. The first one being the establishment of funding arrangements for loss and damage. And the second element of that decision is including the creation of a fund. So the transitional committee that was created in COP27 has to discuss two things: so the funding arrangements for loss and damage, and then the fund itself. So a little bit around the context of what I've already been telling you. So there is historically, has been, and will be a very strong pushback and rejection from developed countries to talk about loss and damage finance. Regardless of the fact that we took a decision to establish a fund, I think everyone needs to remember that the fund in itself is just a pot, but for now it's an empty pot. And developed countries have been very adamant and very clear in saying that they don't have commitments and liability to put resources into that pot. So there's a discussion as to we have the pot now, how do we fill the pot? Part of it will need to come from developed countries' commitments that are derived from their public sectors and from commitments of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. But most of it will need to come elsewhere. And there's a conversation pending as to how we fill that fund, even before it becomes operational. There's a clear link between loss and damage and liability, burden sharing, and historical responsibility. And that's why this is an issue that has been allergic for developed countries historically, particularly the United States. There's a willingness to turn a blind eye as to how the loss and damage fund will be financed. So we established the fund. Now we'll need to see how it is financed. And developed countries have tabled proposals that have been very divisive for the developing world. including, for instance, prioritizing loss and damage financing for the most vulnerable only. And remember that there's no definition as to who are the most vulnerable. And even if there were, and if we were to focus in particular countries, vulnerability very rarely happens at a country level. It happens at a community level or at a place where the flood is actually happening, regardless of what that country's context is. And despite 10 years of official talks around loss and damage, there is again a sudden lack of understanding as to what loss and damage is and what it should be and what should be done. And this lack of understanding, and everyone saying we need to understand better what loss and damage is, what kind of responses are, and how we finance those kinds of responses, and what types of instruments and sources of finance are best suited for each of those responses, will just throw us into an endless conversation and a very delayed operationalization of actual funding sources. And this is my final slide. So what is happening now? We are in a process that is very similar to the one that we took when the GCF was created. The GCF was created in a decision from COP16, so this is 2010. And COP16 created a transitional committee. The transitional committee of the GCF met 3 times in 2017 and came to 2013, sorry, to COP19, to COP17 in Durban. I'm getting lost in all these COPs, to COP17 in Durban in 2011, with what is now called the governing instrument of the GCF. So the governing instrument was basically the rules for the operationalization of the GCF, including what the board is composed of, how it works, what in general the GCF finances, who are eligible for finance, and in general how the GCF works. And the governing instrument allowed for the board of the GCF to begin meeting after COP17, so as of 2012. And it took the board of the GCF 3 more years, since 2012 until mid-2015, to agree on what they called the essential elements for the operationalization of the GCF, which included a resource management framework, a risk management framework, the areas of work of the GCF, the indicators, the methodologies, the process for accessing resources in the GCF, and actually going through a replenishment process and getting resources into a trust fund for the GCF. Now, the reason I'm telling everyone of this history is to go over how funding arrangements tend to work. So regardless of us creating the GCF in 2010, the first project of the GCF was financed mid-2015. So that's around 5 years later. And my expectation would be that the Loss and Damage Fund, which I've been informally referring to as the LDF, because we always have Fs, the SCF, the GCF, the SCCF, now the LDF. My expectation would be that the LDF would also take its time before it begins working. I know that as of the decision of last year, many may have had the expectation that we now have a fund. How do we access the fund? But the truth of the matter is that the transitional committees still has work to do. 2 out of 3 meetings of the transitional committee are done. The mandates of the committee include identifying elements for funding arrangements and identifying and expanding sources of funding. So again, this has to do very much with the predictability of sources that will come into the fund. There is no clarity around that. And even the sources of those resources are not clear. And again, there are split positions in the committee, because you remember the committee is composed of country representatives. So we have developed and developing countries with very different expectations. Developed country representatives in the committee are tending to focus more on identifying and having clarity on loss and damage funding arrangements. So funding arrangements can mean a series of decisions, including inside and outside of the convention, to promote and foster loss and damage finance. And then once we have clarity on the funding arrangements, we'll talk about a fund. Whereas the view of developing countries is to focus on the fund and discuss funding arrangements later on, because funding arrangements can basically be just a set of decisions. The last meeting of the transitional committee will take place in the last trimester of this year, and it's been announced for Dominican Republic, which is a good setting, being that Dominican Republic is a small island developing state. And we'll have to see at the COP what the transitional committee proposes to the COP. It will eventually be something similar to the governing instrument of the GCF, so working modalities for the loss and damage fund. And then the fund and the board of the fund, or whatever governing instrument the fund has, will need to begin having sessions and discussing how to replenish the fund and what the processes for accessing the fund are. And eventually the fund may be operational. So eventually the fund will become operational. My expectation is that the fund may begin working as of late 2025 or maybe 2026. But two things I think are important to support the operationalization of the fund and discussions in COP28, thinking also about civil society participation and engagement in those discussions. So the first one being that regardless of the committee having a mandate to discuss the operationalization of a fund, there's still a technical component that hasn't been responded by anyone. And that is, how does a loss and damage funding proposal look like? So we know that when we are preparing a mitigation or an adaptation proposal with the expectation to receive funding, a couple of criteria must be met, but we have no idea what those criteria are for a loss and damage fund project. We know that a loss and damage fund cannot take as long as the GCF takes. Whereas you present a first concept idea to the GCF and you have 4 or 5 or 7 rounds of commits, each taking a couple of months to come. And then you have to wait for a meeting of the board and wait for a decision. And the project will begin 5 years after you've proposed it originally. That cannot happen with loss and damage, because loss and damage has a very different level of urgency. But there is no clarity as to if that's not the way in which it happens, because that's the experience that we have in the finance world in climate change. How should it actually happen? So what are the indicators that would need to be met? Because at the end of the day, the conversation around finance is also a conversation about transparency. It's a conversation about having clarity on how many resources are being channeled for a specific problem and how that problem has used those resources to transparently solve it and to report on the indicators that that problem is being solved effectively. And that flow, again, in loss and damage is not very clear. So what types of resources are needed? What types of indicators? What types of methodologies should we look at? Those methodologies can definitely be different. I think loss and damage being as complex as it is, the same methodologies and indicators cannot apply for a flood than one of a desertification, for instance, but one being an extreme weather event and another is low onset event. You need to have different sets of methodologies. But currently there is no one working on those methodologies and indicators and processes to channel finance. And I will leave my presentation at that, and I hope it's been interesting for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. I must admit, listening to it, I feel a little bit schizophrenic between extreme cynicism and hope that there are actually processes in place. The reason why I say this is I'm sure a lot of us come from countries where the best way to delay an issue or kill an issue is to set up a commission of inquiry. And it almost feels like the committee is being set up. For me, it just doesn't emerge that there can be, it doesn't compute that there can be, it can take so long. Committees upon committees, the technicalities, and it goes to a question that I think Maria asked in the comments here about a point that Adrian raised around there being a lack of a clear definition of loss and damage, and the question was more, what kind of negative impact does not having a clear definition of loss and damage have on this process? And when these committees are set up, what is to come out of it? But more importantly, I think for me is what are the real and the realistic expectations of civil society to look at, first of all, the GCF, and then subsequently now the loss and damage fund being set up. Is there realistic hope that one can actually feed into that process and actually have something come out of it positively? Or is it a case where these are containers or instruments that are built to buy time, to postpone actually needing to act? Because you also talked about the commitments under the Paris Agreement, which are very clear and are already written down in paper, but a lot of which have not been met yet, are yet to be met. So it's an increase of instruments, questionable levels of political will to actually do something about it, and civil society and communities sit with an expectation, which is raised every so often when there seems to be movement. But are there things that civil society can do in spite of and despite the apparent lack of political will that actually makes a difference for communities? While you mull that over, I'll keep an eye over on other questions or other hands that might shoot up during this time. But please, your comments. And anybody else's comments. Barbara, there are lots of comments from your part, so feel free to unmute as well. But I'll hand over to you, Andres, for some thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question, Josh. As I was saying during my presentation, personally, I'm not of the idea that we need an all-encompassing definition before we begin work. You'll remember that the convention itself, one of the principles of the convention is the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle, what it says is we don't need to be 100% sure we don't need to use lack of certainty as an excuse for lack of action. That's basically what the principle says. And my interpretation of what's happening internationally is that sometimes that's what we do. So saying we need a better understanding, and now we have a formula for how we handle, how we delay those discussions. We tend to have technical expert dialogues, so the famous TEDs. You'll see TEDs everywhere, technical expert dialogues, followed by a high-level ministerial meeting, an HLMD, and we do that for 3 years. And then in the third year, we'll assess what's happened with that work program. We've had those work programs in finance a lot, and they're useless. So from my point of view, if you look at the GCF has its pros and its cons. I was in the board for a few years. It has its pros and its cons. If you think about a pro, the GCF never thought about having a definition of an all-encompassing definition of what it is financing, because it finances a lot of things. What the GCF said is we'll finance two types of things, so mitigation and adaptation. We could do the same with loss and damage, saying extreme weather events and slow onset events. And if those two will have categories. So let's say in mitigation, we'll have energy and industry and transport and waste. And in adaptation, we'll have human settlements and forests and ecosystems and water. And I don't remember those were the categories of the GCF, but I'm trying to give an example in saying that in loss and damage, I think it's important to have expectations around the loss and damage fund. The level of scale that is needed in terms of resources globally to solve loss and damage is much, much larger than the levels of resources that even the GCF itself has. So the loss and damage fund is not going to be a fund to solve all of the loss and damage needs. It's probably going to be a fund to create experience, to work on pilots, and to create experience on when we do have a loss and damage event related to floods, like the ones that we had in Pakistan for last year, for instance. What can the international community and a fund under the UNFCCC do, and what can we learn from that experience? So my thinking is that the loss and damage fund will begin as a pilot fund to have experience on how to address loss and damage and how to manage loss and damage funding. But then what we can do, being aware that it will be a pilot and that it will not be on an all-solving response, is to think, okay, we need experience at least on these two first things. What are the biggest losses and damage that we see for now? Let's prioritize, at least work in the first year around floods. Let's have experiences around floods. And let's have experience around tropical storms, for instance. And let's look at those two for now. Then we'll have a next year working on desertification and on loss of biodiversity, or we need to identify the categories of loss and damage and maybe identify those that are most urgent and try and work on those, so that the clarities around methodologies and what it is that we do and what definitions we use and indicators are developed as we move along. Because if our argument is that everything needs to be developed before we move along, we'll never move. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Thank you very much for that, Andres. Great. We are at the point where we are going to be taking any questions and answers and comments. So Barbara, Path, anybody with any thoughts or additions or comments or questions on the presentation that Andres has so kindly given us, please, I'll keep an eye out for hands. Go ahead, Yared.
Okay, so my question is, in the technical expert dialogues, some of the issues around insurance. I think there is this promotion of insurance, and obviously you hear the social protection and other type of responses. So what is your view from civil society perspective? Because the usual type of responses which would come probably very market oriented, which has to do with private sector and etc. may be suggested. So how does civil society respond to that?
Thank you, Yared. That's a difficult response, to be honest, because loss and damages create a need of not just financial resources, but technical assistance, and in some cases, even humanitarian aid. And it's impossible sometimes to assess the cost, the economic and non-economic losses that are derived from an extreme weather event, for instance, because you don't just have losses in terms of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, but you have losses in terms of heritage, and cultural heritage, and even lives and ancestral knowledge and practices that cannot be retaken after an event has happened. So it's impossible to assess. And when the conversation around loss and damage finance was focusing on private insurance, the response again was partial, because the response of a private insurance can only be, let's say you have a hotel in the Caribbean that in many cases is not even owned by locals, but owned internationally, but by someone in the United States, for instance, by the Marriott chain or the Hilton chain, and you have an extreme weather event that comes and destroys that hotel. You'll have your insurance responding to that, but you won't have your insurance responding to those that first don't have a capacity to pay for that insurance. And second, the insurance will have limitations as to what it can actually cover and what it can't. It mostly focuses on on making sure that the goods that you own are safeguarded, but there are things that are lost beside your goods when you go through losses and damages. So I never liked the conversation around insurances because it also, again, it's basically just a sell pitch in saying you have a problem, so you have to buy something to solve that problem. It's like the conversation we've had in technology. You need technology transfer, that's fine. So these come to this World Fair and buy some, but that's not the response. So I'm not. I think from the civil society perspective, we need to make that a little bit more evident. I mean, having a conversation that sells things to countries that have different needs is not a response. And the civil society hasn't been, to my perspective, as strong as it should be in evidencing these things. We had a very good, and I'm speaking because I was coordinating the G77 and China finance negotiations last COP, but we had a very close conversation with civil society in coordinating with each other before each of the loss and damage finance negotiations. So the presence of civil society outside of the rooms and in creating, you'll remember those handkerchiefs that said pay up for loss and damage, those black handkerchiefs that people had in COP27. Those were great, and just creating that momentum for conversation and giving the impression to developed countries that everyone is looking. I think that's very important. That's the crucial role that civil society has in these spaces.
Great, thank you very much, Andres. Looking if there are any other questions or comments, I mean, suffice to say that the next session that we have will provide further opportunity to ventilate these issues. We'll have a discussion on that. And we're also going to be taking a very short break. But before we do that, I know that we will be using Padlet for the next session that will have Barbara, Path, and Andres as discussants. So I'm going to ask the technical team to just share the instructions for the Padlet as well as the link for that, so we can talk you through it quickly, and you can try and figure out the mechanics of it while you're on your short break, so that when we come back, we can seamlessly get into that discussion.
The break is
the break is going to be about 5 minutes, but before we break, I'm just going to talk you through the interactive board that we are going to use. We've also posted the instructions in the chat, so you will see in the chat that there's a link that has been provided. If you click on that, it should take you straight to the board that has been set up for the purposes of this discussion. And once you have it open, please feel free to add a comment under any of the columns. You'll see columns with different questions. All you need to do is click on the plus sign, and it should allow you to post your comments. So you can post your comments, and while you're posting, this is happening live, so you will see other comments. And if you go in there and find that others have made comments that you'd like to endorse or that you can like, you can like or comment on other people's posts as well. While we are doing that, I don't know, we've got about a minute to go. I see Maria has asked a question: how can we help from the youth on a national scale? So speaking particularly, I mean, not just civil society, but from a youth perspective, what is required? What is required in order for I suppose greater participation of the youth? But maybe may I suggest that we mull over that and cover it in the next session as we go along. So if we will keep these instructions up here, you will still have access to the link, but we are going to take a 5-6 minute break. We will be resuming at 1:45, and we will get into a discussion. I believe Path is back, so it'll be Barbara, Path, and Andres who will be leading that discussion. So let us take a 5-minute break and hope to see you all in about 5 minutes time. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. Welcome back. I don't see, I'm looking at the list of participants and I notice we've got a very admirably small attrition rate after after this long and after our coffee break. So very happy that everybody is still here. Welcome back. I think we all needed a bit of a comfort break. We can see from the screen sharing that some of the questions that we wanted people to address, I can see quite a few comments on there. The idea is that coming out of this session, we as the VCA should have quite a clear idea, or at least some signposts from all of you in terms of how we move forward with the issue of loss and damage. So getting as many contributions here would be very, very useful. We have three discussants for this session. So we've got Barbara, I hope Path is still with us, and Andres. So maybe Barbara, can I just hand over to you to talk through this? What are you starting to see on the board here as somebody who's probably going to have their shoulder to the grindstone when it comes to how VCA proceeds going forward? Are you already starting to see a clear sense of how we move forward with this, something that we can use?
Sorry. Yes, I'm starting to see general proposals on how we move forward. And maybe we continue having a conversation. I really liked Andres' presentation because it really gave us a very clear basis of where we started, but where we are and where we could go, and even pointers on focus areas. And I see that people are reflecting on that. For example, clearly we don't have a definition globally, and I wonder what VCA can do to engage on that definition. And from Andres' presentation, maybe this isn't necessarily a priority for VCA. I don't know, so I think the team can reflect on that. But I see that the critical factors for affecting loss and damage response, I think, is a key one here. And I think VCA, we are on the ground. We have a network of 200 civil society actors who could propose evidence and examples of methodologies that the transitional committees can take on. So I see that as and really providing the evidence of that, of really a local voice to inform that. And I think that connects back to the how do we engage, is how we organize civil society voice. So the first comment on how we engage is highlighting exactly what VCA does, ensure civil society voice is captured. But I think from the team here, I think it would be nice to even go into the real practicalities. What exactly do we do? Starting here, some of the ideas of exactly what we do. And I think it would be nice for Andres to use your experience to give us pointers on the entry points that would be very effective. From the discussion so far, I see, at least from myself, and I've not written this here, is I think I see it here, engaging the transitional committee members in the country, but also at the end. I know Andres mentioned that there's just one more meeting that they are informing. I don't know whether we can engage that and then follow up on the COP, know what has come out of the transitional committee proposals, and then follow that up and influence that way. And then also Andres mentioned that the key, the debate is between developed countries focusing on funding arrangements, developing countries focusing on fund. And I think both need to be debated and engaged. And VCA can provide local voices on these two arguments. What do we propose on the funding arrangements? What do people say? How does money trickle down? And who should fund it? But also funding. How do we make sure that funding reaches, and how do we lobby for that? I see those as clear aspects that we can capitalize on. But yeah, that is briefly what I see emerging from here. Over to you, Andres. And pass.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. If I can also comment on some of the things that I'm looking at coming from our attendees at the event. So the first interesting thing that I see is on the definition of loss and damage. I think one of the problems that we've had is recognizing that loss and damage are negative impacts coming from climate change. But there's always been, even in adaptation, a conversation around causality, because we're supposed to address the impacts that are caused by humanly caused climate change. So there needs to be a component there. And my concern would be that eventually, from the finance perspective, you would require information around that causality. Yeah. So why is that tropical storm caused by climate change? And why is it not the normal cycle of tropical storms that happens in the Caribbean? That is a difficult and horrible question to ask, but it is a question that gets asked in the finance world, sadly. And I'm thinking that in loss and damage, we'll need, similar to what we do in climate change right now, we have this climate rationality with historical data and scenarios and projections to argue in favor of a project. We'll need to have something similar with regards to losses and damages. We might need a database of the occurrence of tropical storms and how often they have been in the last years, and identify how that latency has, or the periodicity has been augmenting, and then we'll create that causality. But I'm not sure that's something that can be done with all of the impacts related to loss and damages. So the first issue on causality, I think that was very interesting. And I also want to comment on the third question on what should be the priorities of the funding arrangement. The point I was making on urgency, I see there that there was a suggestion on working modalities for urgent disbursement, because there is always an obstacle to access resources, and the obstacle is to first prepare a robust proposal with the logic framework and a theory of change and paradigm shift and all of those horrible things that one has to do to convince the funding source. But if a community is faced with an extreme weather event, I don't see how you can demand of it to take the time to prepare all of these documentation before resources can be channeled. So there might be a way, I'm not sure how, but we need to think about it to change the order in which the disbursement comes before the proposal itself. So you might have a simplified process for a proposal, and then the disbursement and all of the implementation of those resources to respond to the impacts. And then maybe after that, you can demand of more detailed information around what has been done and the logic framework and the budget and everything transparently. But I'm not sure how you can do that before. So the point of thinking of an urgent disbursement modality really sounded to me very interesting. So I wanted to just comment on those two things.
Thank you very much, both. Epath, do you want to jump in?
Thanks. Yeah, I would like to make a comment, and if it's okay with the interpreters, I will speak in Spanish. Just let me know if that is a problem.
Well, I think that the main issues and most of the reflections were perfectly made by Barbara and Andre, and by the panelists that were talking before me. But I would like to see in this board the importance of enhancing the local voices. I think this goes in line with the experience mentioned by Andre when the fund was approved, and the relevance that had the presence of the civil society, putting some pressure I think that this is where our alliance, VCA alliance, has an important role to identify those voices and messages and to advocate that articulation and that presence during the COP and also in the different countries. So the actors, the players, and the leaders could also participate in the conversations that are being held in each country, so we can have a strengthened voice and a voice that incorporates the different views of the young people, the indigenous women, and all the communities that are being affected by climate change. I think it's important to empower these communities and these actors and people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paz. Barbara, would you want to pick up on this? And by the way, to everybody else, I'm also keeping an eye out for any comments and anything in the Q&A box. But if you want to also raise your hand and jump in, please go ahead. Especially if you've already posted your comment there and you feel like you want to, expand on it or talk a little bit more about it. I'm just going to check the Q&A box. Okay. The question from Justin is: how should the community and ecosystem-based adaptation be augmented and upscaled to avert further climate change loss and damage? I believe that was that I think was taken on earlier on. It was already answered. Just keeping an eye out for any other new questions on there. I don't see any, but Barbara, please, anything to add here?
Yeah, I see Yared has put up his hand. I think just what to add and just really to complement what most people have said and have been saying, that the value of, for now, for VCA is to mobilize local voices to effectively engage. And I think the challenge we have as a network now is, on the other hand, a bit of the comment I've been putting here, but also a bit of what Andres has mentioned, I think, that the processes are important, but also sometimes the processes, these committees that are set up and etc., on the other hand, are also used as the excuse to delay. So the challenge for us is to balance between the urgency of making sure the fund is created and the modalities are established. It's really making sure that it is implemented and including voices. And the strategy of achieving that, I think, is our critical area that we really need to think through clearly on how to achieve this. And the good thing is that, as we heard today, is that there are key points of engagement. The transition committee is there, but also there are particular donors who are expected to provide funding, who are either blocking or delaying. So those becomes points of engagement. And also there is, in our countries, we know that it's our representatives, our governments who sit on these transition committees, who we need to engage. So it's already showing us clear entry points of engagement, and ours is to mobilize the civil society and local communities to directly speak to these clear entry points of engagement, so that we are fairly effective and achieve the impacts we have. Finally, I like a clear comment that is being highlighted here, where I think someone mentioned that we need to link the loss and damage fund with country-based funding mechanisms. The issue is we have already clear funding mechanisms. I mean, as Andres has been talking about GCF, we have GEF. In most of, at least in Africa, most countries have established local level community development funds, which can be used for funding even loss and damage. How do we use this? Okay, my proposal is for us to mobilize the society, position these existing mechanisms already, so that then we preempt or avoid this argument that, we have to create a new fund, we have to create a new mechanism, we have to create a new, only improve this so that then we move faster towards action. That's my general observation here.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I must apologize to Yared. He's sitting right next to me and I'm ignoring it. And, yeah, they say a prophet is not known in his hometown. Over to you, Yared.
The VCA Alliance, we have more than 170 local partners embedded in climate affected communities. So we are probably in a very strategic position to bring this voice up. So probably I will speak to the research done by our colleagues in Indonesia around loss and damage. I think Taki was speaking to it earlier in the day on a number of case stories which they were developing. And similarly, as well, Protest has been publishing newspaper articles on loss and damage. So what I'm trying to say is, if VCA have this reach to the communities, how could we bring that voice? A number of cases which could develop it. For instance, probably, obviously, it's a time issue. And the first technical expert dialogue, one of the opportunities was to present cases or stories to the expert dialogue. So it's the same opportunities are there. And how do we sort of develop cases, a number of cases which we could present at a global level? That's one of the opportunities which we need to take on. And then obviously there are, I think, opportunities for submission to the Transitional Committee, and hopefully through the VCA Alliance, we will be able to do that. And I'm assuming that the VCA Alliance, as well as colleagues who are participating in this session, it is a broader church of sorts, so we could work together on that. And the third is, I think, at the national capitals, and for instance, my colleagues in Zambia, they are very much in a good position in terms of, I think Zambia is chairing the Africa Group of Negotiators this year, and they are probably strategic. But obviously, in each capital, you have national government representatives which are engaged in this transitional committee, as well as when in the upcoming interministerial sessions. How do we engage them? So engage them based on evidence. So we develop a set of evidences, we develop our key asks, then engage at the national level, and then we can bring that up through the global program to sort of engage at the UNFCCC levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yared. Andres, there's a comment that is especially for you. I mean, it has been very enriching listening to your presentation and some of the ideas that you're advancing, given your vast experience and your expertise in this area. And the question is, the person asking the question is wondering if there are any articles you've published or any spaces in which your ideas are articulated, because I think for the VCA, having the knowledge resources, I mean, to have this webinar and listen to you is one thing, but to have a continuous access to knowledge resources and some of the ideas and to learn from the experiences that you and others have would be great. So maybe you want to touch on that. I know it's slightly to the side of the discussion right now, but I think you might it might be important for you to touch on that as well.
Thank you very much, Josh, for that question. We did collaboratively. Sorry, so we did collaboratively with a couple of colleagues publish an article last week around the difficulties of defining climate finance. It's not necessarily focused on loss and damage itself, but you can find it around, and in the website of Avina, we have a guidebook for climate negotiators, which goes around the context and the workings of climate negotiations, and it's available in 3 languages: in Spanish, in English, and in French. So if any of you want to get acquainted with the climate negotiations, I would also suggest you take a look at that. But since Avina itself is part of the VCA Alliance, we'll make sure to try and find other additional resources that we can share with everyone who's been joining with us today.
Yeah, no, thanks. And you make a very good point on that, because I mean, for us as alliance partners, we need to resist the temptation to involve in echo chamber discussions where we assume that everybody knows. Whereas, I mean, we have a large constituency of peoples we are speaking to today, and we need to make sure that this is something we can discuss with our communications folks, to make sure that some of these great resources are also a little more outward facing, so that those who participate in these discussions can also have access to them. So thank you very, very much for that. Just checking if there are any other comments or questions on this. Any final thoughts from the three of you? I'm actually quite gratified at the number of comments that have popped on here. I mean, this, I believe, I'll check, just checking that this Padlet link will be live for a while. So those who may not have an opportunity to pop their ideas on here, and again, in whichever language you choose, will still be able to do it post this webinar going forward. All right. Just checking from our three discussants if there's anything you might want to add on this. Okay, great. In which case, I think just thank you very much to the three of you, and thank you to everybody who's popped who's put comments on the Padlet, their different views. And again, as I mentioned, we'll continue to engage with this. And maybe at this point, I will hand over to Yared again for a couple of reflections before we wrap up the session.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh. So this loss and damage finance is one work area for the global program and VCA. And this is an area which we're going to work for the next 2 years and a half. And it's just it is a socialization exercise now. We are trying to familiarize our colleagues across the board what the opportunities for influencing and what will be the strategy we need to adopt to be effectively engaging this at a national level as well as at the global level. So going forward, obviously, we will reach out to you in the coming days with a number of activities. I think we have developed a set of activities in response to this idea, and probably as well, hopefully, I'm not promising, but engagement with someone from the transitional committee at the UNFCCC, if that could be possible, that probably we will sort of facilitate such interface with, and I'm hoping by then probably as well we'll be able to develop a set of cases and which we could use to influence, and we will be as well working on our position as VCA. What is the position of the climate affected communities' position on this conversation? Those are like a number of activities we are planning. So thank you so much from myself, and I think again there will be another round of conversation on some other areas on the climate finance aspect. I think Karen will speak to it in a minute. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Yared. And just I'm going to be handing over to Karen to give some further information and to formally close out the session. So just from on my own behalf, I'd like to say thank you very much for the wonderful discussions we've had today. Thank you so much to Protas, to Adrian earlier on, to Andres, and everybody who participated in this discussion, to Path, and of course to you, Barbara, for being a discussant in this session. I think it's been a wonderful experience. And again, just to mention that the recordings will be shared as part of the postcom. So we hope that we can treat this as an ongoing conversation. And yeah, with that, I will hand over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'd like to give a round of thanks to everybody. Thank you so much to our speakers and panelists for being with us today and for sharing your insights in our session. We'd like to thank the interpreters as well for doing another sterling job on the interpretation, and to our attendees as well for being with us today and for participating in the discussions. It was really great and enriching and nice to have you all here. Thanks to Yared and Josh for moderating and for doing the scene setting and overviews. And of course, to our technical team in the background as well for helping us troubleshooting the little niggles and for screen sharing as well. For our next sessions, we'd like to invite you to our next event on the 17th of August. And it's about MDB reform, which is multilateral development banks reform. So if you'd like to get invitations to that session, please subscribe to our newsletter. And you will receive regular updates on what we are doing. Also, please follow us on our social media accounts. Visit our website for updated content and news from our various regions. Follow us on Twitter. Our tag is @WeAreVCA. And of course, we're on YouTube and LinkedIn as well. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody again for being here, and good night or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much, and goodbye.